So
I'll start just by greeting everybody. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Thank you for joining us today. This is the last colloquium of the year for our group, Migration, Ethnicity, Race and Health Working Group. And we are very excited about the speaker today. I'm gonna let Catalina introduce her and give you a sense of who the speaker is if you haven't done that research yet, which I know some of you have already been looking into it.
All right, well, hi everyone. I'm very pleased to present today Dr. Rima Afifi. Dr. Afifi is a professor in the Department of Community and Behavioral Health in the Iowa College of Public Health, and she engages in public health research and practice with intent to promote social, community, and policy environments conducive to well-being. Most of her work is centered around adolescent and youth health and well-being and on the Arab world. And today, Dr. Afifi will be talking about community engaged research with refugee populations. So without further ado, I leave you with Dr. Afifi.
Thank you, Catalina and Anna. It's a pleasure to be with you today. And I'm so excited to just share some ideas with you. And thank you for inviting me to do that. I'm going to share my screen here in a second and see if. All right, Catalina, can you see that? Perfect. All right, wonderful. So again, I'm so pleased to be speaking to this group, and I love the title of this group, Migration, Ethnicity, Race, and Health. And I've been looking at the various things that you've been doing and talks that you've been having, and it's fascinating. It's just a wonderful space, I think, for some critical reflection on the important issues around migration, ethnicity, race, and health. And I also very much liked how you described the group as made up of departments and programs inside and outside Drexel community, including community partners. And even the way that you've described it is so beautiful and so conducive to the topic that I'm going to be talking about today, which is community engaged research with refugee populations, and how I believe that's all about flipping power dynamics, uplifting strengths, and enhancing equity and dignity. I'll give you a little background about myself, because I think that that's really important and part of what's critical in our engagement with community, to understand each of our whys, what brings us here, why we do this work, why it's important, who we are, what is our space in this work. So I was born and raised in Beirut, Lebanon, and worked there for 20 years of my life. All of my upper education or university education was in the United States. I started off in psychology and then moved quickly to public health. I loved everything about psychology, but I wanted to be on the preventive side, and that's what moved me to public health. And after being 13 years in the United States working and finishing my education, I actually went back to Lebanon and spent 20 years of my career at the American University of Beirut at the Faculty of Health Sciences, doing public health work in contexts of conflict, uncertainty, migration, displacement. And much of my work remains in that space. And it really, both being raised, born and raised in Beirut, and my own experiences, as well as the work experience that I had, have really shaped the way I think about these issues, and really, I think, made it so important for me to do work that's community engaged. I also am a product of a pretty multidisciplinary, I think, family situation. My father is Palestinian, so we ourselves are refugees. And that's why I was born and raised in Lebanon. I've been to Palestine one time, and it was beautiful, and I hope to continue to go. My mother is American. They met in Beirut, so you might think the opposite, but they met in Beirut. And so that was also really important in the way that I think about things, because it was the merging of cultures, religions, etc., and really brought to light the importance of acceptance and belonging in a very broad sense. As growing up, Lebanon is a very interesting system, and being Palestinian in Lebanon, that was really hard in terms of belonging. And so, I mean, all of my thinking through of what this means, I think, is very much influenced by my own experiences of growing up, working and living in a beautiful place like Beirut, which I consider my home. So that just gives you a little background of what I bring to this work and why I do this work, I think. All right, let's move on. I'm also very happy to take questions as we go along or at the end. So what I'm hoping to do today, and not in any order, but is to think about defining what I call participatory praxis and community engaged research, or what is called, it's not, I did not coin the term, to explore the continuum of participatory practice and community engaged research, to center the values and principles of this work, to suggest some questions that help us to assess the extent to which our work is participatory or engaged, to really talk about the role of the researcher and positionality in this work, and then to talk about research relevance, rigor, and reach in relation to community engaged research. And I'm going to be doing that mostly giving examples from two particular projects that I've been involved in that have been community engaged, and I'll talk about those, both related to refugee mental health. All right, so this is sort of the conclusion of the talk, which is to go in search of people, to begin with what they know and to build on what they have. So it's really centering community, it's centering community knowledge. It's really already starting to flip the idea of who's an expert to basically say we are all experts or none of us are experts, whichever way you prefer to say it. I prefer to say we are all experts. Each of us brings something to the table. And I think the difficulty about this is the more education we have, the more we are taught that makes us the expert as opposed to a expert. And so part of the, I think, work in community engaged research is to unlearn a lot of what we have learned in academia in terms of what makes an expert. That's, I think, part of the important and hard work of community engaged research. The second part I think is really important that we'll get to is that the scientific method that we learn about is one way of getting to evidence, but there are many, many, many other ways of evidence. A lot of it is indigenous, community-based that we really, that academia ignores to a great extent. And community engaged research brings that to the forefront and basically says, you know, the way that we've learned to do research, the way that we've learned what evidence is just one way. And that we are not going to solve these intractable problems by only thinking about one way to do research. And so we'll talk more about these ideas as we go along. All right. Oops, sorry. Okay, so participatory praxis. And for most of these slides, I have references at the bottom where you can go to get more information if you like. I'm also happy afterwards, you know, if there's a particular idea that you want more, to read more about, I'm happy to send those. So participatory praxis is a collection of research methods that documents, acknowledges, and respects local knowledge. So again, going back to this idea of what knowledge counts, what knowledge is evidence, okay? And this is saying local community-based knowledge is its evidence. And in fact, in a lot of the times, what we bring to the table definitely alone can't solve the problem and may just be a tool to the solution of a problem. It's an approach to negotiate differences between researchers and community members so that the research perspective doesn't supersede the community perspective nor subordinates the community in its intent or outcome. So centering community values, centering community perspectives, centering community needs and desires. And participatory methods take their starting point from strengths and assets that are inherent in a community, rather than from a weakness and deficit perspective. And I think this is a really important point as well, because we often approach a community from a deficit perspective. There's a problem and we quote unquote want to solve it. And we often don't think about the strong, deep strengths and assets that are in every community, irrespective of whether there are also issues and problems, and how centering strengths and assets actually changes our perspective in very interesting ways, and the starting point becomes different. And I'll just give an example of the aha moment I had in this space. So as Katarina described, a lot of my work has been with young people, and for a long time we keep using these words of youth at risk, youth at risk, youth at risk. You know, so that's how we look at youth. Now, if you think about that framing of young people, it lends itself to particular solutions. It lends itself to particular interactions with young people. There's a lot of concern about what's going to happen with young people. You know, what might they do? I mean, it's a very negative deficit perspective. And about now 2 decades ago, I watched a beautiful TED Talk that really changed my attitude about this and really made me understand Strengths and Assets. And it was a person that was suggesting that we change the paradigm and consider all youth at promise. Now, if you step back for a minute and think about that change in language, youth at promise, and how if we start from that perspective of youth at promise, how everything after that follows and changes, how our approach changes, how our interaction with young people changes, how the possibilities of what we're going to do together changes. And that, I think, is a really just a small example of the importance of strengths and asset-based approach as opposed to weakness and deficit perspectives. So community engaged research is the process of working collaboratively with and through groups of people affiliated by a variety of things. Often it's by geographic proximity, but also it could be special interests, similar situations, to address the issues that are affecting the well-being of the people, the communities that we're working with. And community engaged research is really a paradigm shift to conducting science that can integrate community voices, minoritized voices, communities of colors as equal collaborators. And I'd say, in fact, and we'll see this in a minute, drivers of the work that we're doing together. And that has been argued as a step in the right direction to achieve health equity for people. And is challenging in a lot of ways because of what I've said we've been taught, and how to unlearn what we've been taught to authentically be able to do community engaged research. I always talk a little bit about ontology and epistemology because I think, again, our training is mostly in one type of ontology and epistemology, and community engaged research and all the methods and approaches that come with it come from a different starting point. And unless we understand that, then we're always going to get pushback that it may be a lesser approach or a lesser research methodology. So ontology is basically, and I apologize if I'm repeating things that you already know, but I think just in my experience talking about community engagement and talking about participatory processes, just sort of starting with ontology and epistemology is important to everything else that follows. So ontology is a belief about the nature of reality, what exists, what's true. And there are many ontologies, but I'm going to talk specifically about two that are often spoken about: realism and relativism. So realism is the belief that there is one truth, that this truth doesn't change, that it can be discovered using objective measures, and that it can be generalized. Whereas relativism is this idea that there are multiple realities and truths, that reality and truth is very much shaped by context, that evolves and changes based on our experiences. So what we see as true when we're young may be somewhat different than what we see as true when we're adults, maybe somewhat different than what we see as true as older adults. It also changes with where we are at a particular time and space in our lives, and what kind of circumstances we're in. And relativism would say that truth isn't generalizable, but it is transferable to similar contexts. And so the work that we do in community engaged research, the work of centering community, the work of thinking about multiple types of truths, of evidence, that's all relativism rather than realism, where much of what we learn in academia is very much based in a realism perspective, at least in sort of the biomedical realm, which often, health is subsumed under that, despite what we know very well about the political, social, economic determinants of health. So, and again, just to think about, where the starting point is. And so really the beliefs about what we believe about reality influences every decision we make about how we practice, how we do research, and, and everything else, including how we decide what is to be studied, which is epistemology. So epistemology is, okay, now how do we gather new data? And of course, that's driven by what we think about the nature of reality, how we come to know what we know, how objective the relationship is between researcher and what can be known, and what the relationship is between the researcher and the research. And there's two approaches that I'll talk about here. One is the etic approach, which is the outsider's view. So this is more, experts deciding what the topic is that should be studied, how we should be studying it, gathering data, analyzing it without much input from quote unquote those that they are studying. And an emic approach is taking an insider's view. So it's this idea that we are embedded within community, that we're learning all together, that we're co-learning, and that our understanding of what's real is very open to everybody's perspectives. So again, community engaged research, community-based participatory research, participatory praxis comes from a relativism emic approach to research. I'm just, okay, participatory praxis seems perfectly, I'm just looking at the chat. Yes, I would agree 100%. And thinking about how art, I mean, yeah, art and expression in art in all the various ways that it can be done. Yes.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Could you just repeat the question, because I think only
yes.
and
Sorry.
can see it. I don't think everyone
definitely will do that. Thank you for that. Okay, so the comment was participatory praxis seems perfectly aligned with the spirit of the arts. Something that I think public health has yet to embrace. How do you think the arts can be leveraged in participatory praxis and research? And what arguments can we make to our peers and others outside our field to support use of art as a tool to advance public health? So this is a beautiful question. I would agree 100% that the arts in all of its forms are very important in participatory praxis and have been used. So we have a review article of sort of community engaged research in relation to young people. And one of the things that we bring up is the arts as a mechanism for community engaged research and participatory praxis. Because the arts have a very unique way of really centering individual as well as community knowledge, beliefs, missions, values, everything. And so I would agree there's a huge need to include arts and many of the methods of participation. And also I'm happy to share some of this, the ways that we work with community to think about what the issues are very much either visual arts or other kinds of arts. There is, I'm blocking now on it. There's Theater of the Oppressed, which is I don't know if you all have heard about this. I am very eager to get trained in this method. I haven't yet found the time to do so. But Theater of the Oppressed is one mechanism that's used across the world for participatory praxis and really to think about what oppression looks like and what are some solutions to oppression. So absolutely, like visual arts, theater arts, auditory, all the arts are critical for this work. Thanks for that. All right, let me get back to here a minute. Okay, so I'm going to be talking, I'm going to be giving some examples. I see it's already 10:20. All right, some examples of this from two projects. A mental health intervention that we are currently engaged in with refugees in Eastern Iowa. And I'm particularly going to talk about the pilot project. So this intervention was with Congolese refugees from the Congo and refugees from Sudan who live in Eastern Iowa, around Iowa City. There was some work that had been done that indicated, not surprisingly, that mental health issues were very salient. And of course, you all have been talking about migration, and there's so many points in the migratory journey where trauma happens. In addition to once you resettle, just like figuring out this new space, being in a space that's not necessarily very welcoming, and you're still carrying a lot of trauma from the journey and everything that happened previous to the journey. But at the same time, at least in places like Iowa City, there's not much trauma-informed care. There's not much, mental health support that is culturally tailored or relevant. And so the clashes and the lack of trust between communities and systems are difficult. I also want to say that when I speak about mental health, I speak on sort of the right side, well, yeah, whichever side, on the side of the continuum that talks about mental health from, 100% well-being, which I think is very rare, to 100% ill health or ill being, which is also rare, but there is a continuum. And there's been a lot of work, particularly in humanitarian settings, to look at a pyramid of support for mental health. And at the bottom of the pyramid are all the issues around rights, justice, equity, which is about providing, stress around, support around stress and coping that can be done from non-trained, non-experts, I guess, or non-officially trained mental health providers. And at the top of the pyramid is, those mental health conditions that might be diagnosable and actually need support from trained mental health providers. Although I'll also say that a lot of mental health A lot of our solutions in the clinical setting to mental health are very biomedical, are very individualistic, and don't necessarily consider social justice as a core aspect of healing. So, there's problems all around. There's a lot of things I could talk about in terms of mental health. So the work we do is at the bottom of the pyramid. It's peer-to-peer support. It's community support. So from refugee community members to other community members. And it's based on evidence that's been provided by WHO and other places. The particular program that we work is Problem Management Plus, which is a low-intensity psychosocial mental health intervention that's given by lay community members or community mental health workers, if you want, to their own communities. And we pilot tested this in Iowa. PM Plus has been tried all over the world, but it's actually never been implemented with refugees in a high-income setting. And so that was what we did. We piloted, and now we're scaling up. The other is through a youth mental health project that we did now over 10 years ago in one of the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. And this was, so PM Plus is like a 5-session intervention, so relatively quick, and teaching skills, and mostly to adults. This project was a year-long intervention, so very, very different, working mostly with young people around social skills building for mental health promotion. And where this one's relatively recent, so we haven't yet published on it, the mental health intervention in Beirut has many references, and I'm happy to share these slides. So if you want to read about, we've written about every single part of this community-based research project. All right, so this is the continuum of community engaged research, right? It goes from one end of no community involvement to the other end of community driven or community led. And when we think about the continuum, so from no community involvement to community informed, and I'll talk a little more about what this means, to community consultation, to participation, to community-based participatory research, which isn't the end. The end is community-driven, community-led. The indicators of equity in this process are things like who has power and control, who owns decision-making, where is responsibility centered, who has the more influence, what is the mutual benefit? And I'd say, what is the benefit to community primarily? And is there resource sharing, including financial resources? And the contextual factors that influence the continuum and where we are at the continuum are huge, right? Their history, their trust, how much have we invested in relationship building? Is there respect? Is there transparency? I do want to stop at history for a moment, because I think one of our big mistakes is that when we come in to work with community, we almost see that as the starting point of everything, where the community has had a huge history up to this point and will continue to have a history after the particular interaction that we're having with them is gone. And to ignore that history basically opens up the possibility of a lot of mistakes that we might do, as well as harm. And I hope to talk about this a little more as we go along, but just to give an example, there's politics in every community. If you ever walk into a community and it looks like everything is perfect in that community, you should know that you haven't reached community yet, because there is no community that doesn't have a history of politics and a history of strengths, but also a history of challenges. And it's critical to understand that community. So if you take, if Lebanon, as one example, we have 18, sects and in various religions, and the interaction of those sects and how they've interacted over time and the shifting loyalties, really important to know that if we walk into community and to understand what has happened in that small community in relation to these histories, because otherwise we may be inviting people to the table that are just one part of the community and increasing the mistrust that's being built, across sectors. So again, same thing in the Syrian context, same thing in any context that you work in. Understanding history, understanding politics is super important to the work. So this continues that idea of the continuum of community engaged research, and basically gives the community perspective and the research perspective on this continuum. So at one end, no community involvement, the community perspective would be, we don't know anything about this project. And the researcher's perspective, we'd had no contact with community. Whereas community informed, the community might say, well, maybe we're not aware of this project, but we were told about it. And the researcher perspectives, well, we sat on a meeting and we learned a lot, and we took what we learned and, maybe influenced the intervention of it, but that's it. Whereas at the other end, if you look at community-based participatory research, the communities would say we participated in all aspects equitably. And the researcher would say we developed the project together with community partners. So there's co-learning and co-development. And at community-driven led, the community would say we fully own the research, and the researcher would say the community is in charge and we support their efforts when asked. So we are in service to community. And this one is sort of what is the community involvement and activity and what's the researcher involvement and activity. So again, at one end, no community involvement, community is not included in any aspect of the research, whereas at the other end, they lead and own the research. And the researcher works independent of community on the end of no community involvement, and is community supports the community to identify research efforts at the other end of the continuum. See something coming to the chat. Yes, how do you address history in your current research with refugees from the Congo and the Sudan? The interrelationship among the community now that are influencing their experiences now, and the longer, larger histories that affect current relationships. In other words, how do you take these histories into account in working with communities to identify community health workers? So that's an excellent question and really relevant, both within community and across community. So for example, if we take the refugees from the Congo here, in Iowa City, those come from different places. So some of them have come directly from the DRC, maybe directly from Kinshasa, and others had a history where they moved somewhere else, perhaps to a refugee camp, and then came to the United States. And just knowing that tells you a lot about the experience that they had in the Congo, and perhaps what political, social, economic situations they had that were different. And it is quite important to know that ahead of time, and to know that we must reach out and engage to the larger, to the diversity of community, if we are going to be successful in achieving the goals that we have. So if we, and by the way, often when we first approach community, if all we do is sort of ask for community leaders, that's not necessarily going to get you to the diversity of community, because again, in every community there are stigmas, there are biases, there are, sort of first worlds and third worlds, as some people say. And so who we meet in the beginning is not necessarily representative of the whole community, as in any community, as in the United States, cities, or, everywhere this is the truth. So our commitment to community engaged research actually means a commitment to a pretty long process of engagement, understanding, ensuring that the people around the table represent, quote unquote, as much as possible, the diversity of the community that we were working with. So we were very conscious about this, the various potential diversities in both the community from Sudan, so are they coming South Sudan, are they coming from the other parts of Sudan, and of course from the Congo, and ensuring that first that we understood, because there's no way, and that's part of the cultural humility part of this, right? There's no way that we can understand all of these conflicts without actually talking to people who are deeply rooted in and feel belonging to those places, and are able to explain to us after we've done a lot of our own research, of course, but explain to us the nuances that we may not be able to see in anything that we're reading, in a sense. And then engaging interested community health workers from a variety of perspectives, so that when these services are being offered to the community, everybody, and that's a tall order, but many people can see themselves. And I think that's how I always think about it. How many people can see themselves in this program, feel like it's relevant to them, feel like they have some aspect of the intervention that really talks to them and means something to them, both in the community health workers and in the people, in their peers that they're working with. Did that answer the question? Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. So community-based participatory research is one approach that's towards the end of the right. Okay, now I will say that I think any movement on the continuum is good movement. So if we can't start with community-based research, or if we can't start with community-driven, community-led, anything that moves us in that direction is really important, I believe, to authentic research that we do. Community-based participatory research is a partnership approach to research that equitably involves community members, organizational representatives, and researchers, as well as others in all aspects of the research process. And some of what I'm going to be talking about today and the examples that I'm going to be giving come from this article that's listed at the bottom that we just published recently on implementing community-based participatory research with communities affected by humanitarian crises. So I also leave that reference there for you. So there are 10, sometimes 11 principles of CVPR, community-based participatory research. I'm going to be talking about 10 of them, and again, giving examples as I go along of how these were implemented in the context of those two projects that I talked about. So the first principle of CVPR is recognizing community as a unit of identity. And that means that so the starting point is that the group that we're working in sees each other and themselves can define themselves as a community, right? They see them, they identify with the particular community that we are hoping to work together with. And this might be difficult in humanitarian settings, right? Because the experience of displacement itself due to a humanitarian crisis is very profound. So displacement can strengthen some ties among people because they're sharing a particular experience, but it can also break a lot of community ties. So you go from a place where you know everybody, you know the communities, and all of a sudden you're not necessarily all moving. You're moving, and the people around you, some of them you know, some of them you don't know. We've seen this interestingly in many of the the refugee crisis, where you all of a sudden see an uptick in young marriages, early marriages, because there's so much fear. I mean, we can talk a lot about early marriages, but there's sort of fear of the other, being in a space where you don't know the other, and concern about particularly, young girls. And so families are quicker than to try to find somebody that they think is safe, quote unquote. And that is an indicator of this fear around, what is my community, and all of the difficulty of moving and migration that can break community ties. So this crucial concept of, is community a unit of identity, is maybe hard to define in a humanitarian setting. So sometimes we step back and you think, well, can you even do CVPR in a humanitarian setting where people have just moved and may not even consider themselves a unit of identity, and where's the starting point there? And a lot of, once you're displaced, you can lose a lot of aspects of your identity, such as your language and culture. You may not be able to, to apply those in the same way. And, you're in the process of trying to maintain or redefine your identity. Community belonging can take a lot of, different forms. And so to think about that, and to think about what does that mean for our work in CVPR. So as I already have said, refugees who resettled in Iowa that were coming from the DRC, some of them arrived on a diversity immigrant visa, and they were coming from Kinshasa, but others were coming from a different place through another mechanism, and trying to think about like how do we bring people together around a common identity? What is the common identity, while at the same time not ignoring that there is histories of conflicts between these people, and putting those on the table. And that gets to the 10th principle of CVPR, which we'll get to shortly. The second principle of CVPR is that it builds on the strengths and resources within a community. So this idea of an asset versus a deficit approach. And strengths can take many forms. So strengths include human capital, they include social capital, they include natural resources, sometimes physical capital, financial resources, etc. And often what happens in humanitarian settings is I'm using the big we, rush in to help, right? And that comes, of course, from a place of good intention. But often that is very much of a deficit-oriented model, and it forgets the assets and strengths in community. So in larger displacement or humanitarian crisis, human capital is really significant. I mean, if you think about the Syrian refugee crisis, even in Lebanon, there is 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. Of course, amongst those, there are physicians, there are nurses, there are engineers, there are people that are educators, there are teachers, and to ignore that completely and come in and build schools and bring into schools either people that are coming from contexts that are completely different from the Arab world, or only Lebanese teachers, or to assume that the provision of healthcare is completely within the clinical settings on the Lebanese side, primary healthcare only, that are, Lebanese primary healthcare physicians, who, by the way, the politics again between Lebanon and Syria, and understanding that before we start to do this work, totally ignoring that, there are resources within the community that are going to be accepted more, trusted more, and probably be much more effective, is one of the big, deficits, I think, in an approach that's humanitarian, when we don't recognize, when we don't start from a place of strength and resources. So in Qadirun, what we did with this, so that's the Palestinian intervention. We actually engaged what we called youth mentors. So this was as I said, it was a social skills building intervention, a year long, that was intended to work with kids that were 11, 12, 13, out of school, but we used the school as a place to do the intervention. And then there was a group of basically facilitators or implementers. Many of them had identities that were Palestinians, but no longer lived in the refugee camp. So none of our facilitators actually lived in the camp. And so what happened is that we engaged 25 young people that were between 17 and 25. And we called them youth mentors, that were from the same camp, from Bujra-Brajni refugee camp. And I tell you, they were just, without them, we would have failed drastically, because they knew the context so well. The young people, the kids trusted them implicitly. They also had their eye and ear to the ground all the time, so that they were able to tell us what things were happening in the community, when we needed to rethink, how to move forward, what to do. So many ways they were really critical to our success in that program. So again, to think about the strengths that are in that program. We also used the physical capital in the community. So we used one of the UNRWA school buildings. We were given permission to use the whole floor. And so we worked within the community. And then we also, in terms of sort of financial capital, we were committed to buying everything from within the camp. So any food, any drink, any drinks that we needed for the program, everything was bought, supplies, whatever we could was bought within the camp. So we were also contributing to, the economic viability, in a sense, of the camp itself. So just again, some thinking about strengths and resources within community. Principle 3 is that it facilitates collaborative, equitable partnerships in all research phases and involves an empowering and power sharing process that attends to social inequalities. And one of the things that we did here in the Qadirun program is that we established a community advisory board. And so I'm going to go to the next slide here for a second, just to talk about community advisory board. So this advisory board included researchers, it included agency staff, it included community members. And of course, because this was all about young people, it also included young people. And we learned a lot, because of course the books say that if you are going to be doing work with young people, then young people should be around the table. And yes, great, they should be. We had them around the table. They were totally committed. They came to every single meeting. They said nothing. All right, now, if you think about the context of collectivist societies and small groups of people, technically anybody on the advisory board either was related to these young people or knew somebody who was related to these young people. And particularly in patriarchal societies, or in societies where there's a hierarchy of power in the family, in a sense, having what a young person says is not only about their own opinion, but has a lot of it has a relation to how people perceive they've been raised. So it has impact on their families or their parents. So young people are going to be careful about what they say in a context where that could mean something about their parents or about how people perceive them as well. And so again, they came to every meeting totally committed, didn't say anything else. What we ended up doing is we ended up creating an additional advisory board that was all young people. So the nice thing about that is that there was a lot more young people involved in the advisory board, which was wonderful. But the other thing is then when 2 people from this larger young people's advisory board came to the community advisory board, they were speaking for young people. And so that was a little safer in a sense. It wasn't that they were speaking for themselves only, but for sort of the group. And that worked out for us in a great way. So that's just sort of, that was my youth question to remind me to talk to you about that. We've talked about this a little bit, but that it's really important in a community advisory board to acknowledge the diversity of any group. I mean, we tend to think that, you know, if we get 3 or 4 people, that means that they're speaking for all Palestinian refugees in this, you know, or all Congolese refugees, or, and that's not true. We would never expect that if somebody invited us, they would think that we're speaking for all academics. So, I mean, again, it's sort of just breaking down our thought process. But again, thinking what community members are we engaging and how can we try to be quote unquote representative where possible. Community advisory boards usually have formal rules of engagement, and that's very important, bylaws. So decisions about how we make, you know, how we're going to make decisions, how we're going to vote, etc. And these bylaws can change. So when we established the community advisory board in the beginning, the rule for making any decisions was that each of us, each organization had 1 vote. So if 5 people came from the university, we only had 1 vote. And that was because there wasn't very much trust that we were all in it for the same reason. A year later, we changed that, and it was every person had a vote. And that was a clear indication that trust had been built in the process. But trust and relationship building really take time. And I love this quote. Somebody said, "We're moving at the speed of trust." So, you know, sometimes it feels slow, but that's what trust takes. And it means a lot of sitting with uncertainty and a lot of sitting with discomfort. And the other thing about trust and relationship building is that it's also about being present. So as it's about getting to know the whole persons that we're working with, and having them get to know us, not just the part of us that's academia. It means engaging in community activities, being there for funerals, being there for weddings, being there for the important events, and sharing ourselves. But maintaining those strong relationships really takes regular communications, transparency, trust. And so the facilitators of the process, of course, need to attend to both the interpersonal process, but also achieving the tasks. And so you need a really good facilitator. And the best, I think, is to have sort of co-facilitators, a community member, facilitator, and somebody from academia. And then, as I've said, everything's political, and language and the language we use matters a lot. All right, so that was sort of a little bit about facilitating collaborative, equitable partnership. And of course, we could spend an hour on each one of these principles. The 4th is promoting co-learning and capacity building among partners. And I think this is really important and does start from that. Actually, I like the word capacity strengthening a lot more, and I'm using that more these days, because I think capacity building starts from a point if there's no capacity, and that's never the case. But the co-learning part is getting to what we talked about in terms of breaking down this idea that somebody has the expertise to provide and the other people don't have the expertise. And co-learning means that we're all in the learning process. So in the Iowa PM Plus project, what we did is we all went through a training around PM Plus together. And the pilot project was like every time they implemented one of the sessions of PM Plus, first we talked through it a lot, and there was such beautiful. So in implementation science or implementation research, we talk about the difference between fidelity and fit. So fidelity is if you take an evidence-based intervention, you're implementing it exactly as it was implemented. And fit is that adaptation process, is acknowledging that when an intervention was evaluated or tried, it might have been evaluated in a context very different than the one that you're currently implementing it in. And sticking to it exactly as is may not lead to effectiveness. So fit is this idea of how do we adapt a little bit to fit the community. And in that process, there's this idea of reinvention. So how do we do things a little differently to make it fit? And as we were going through the training for PM Plus and taking sort of one module at a time, thinking about it, implementing it, there was so much beautiful reinvention that was happening from our community facilitators in terms of what would work, given what they know about stigma in their own communities, about the histories and politics in their own communities, and about approaches, how to approach these various topics in their communities. And so that's an example of sort of co-learning and capacity building. CBPR integrates and achieves a balance between research and action for mutual benefit. So the action part is really important for CBPR and particularly important for community members. Research has a timeline that's often not very great for community action. We take so long to, to get through, our research and make sure it's, exactly as it should, and analysis. And partially it's because we're doing research and education and service all at the same time. But communities, they want action now. And so having this balance between research and action was really important. And I'd say in both of our projects, they saw the implementation of the intervention as action. So we were really interested in the research aspect of it. They were really interested in the fact that they were providing an important intervention, important service that gave them a sense of, that gave them a real sense of purpose, our community partners, in being able to influence a little bit of, what was happening on the ground. Okay, so then emphasizing public health problems of local relevance and ecological perspective that attends to multiple determinants of health and disease. And so CBPR sort of says, first, the problem has to be locally determined. And in both the projects, we went through a needs assessment process that identified the issue that we wanted to focus on. But the real analysis of the problem from an ecological perspective is also important, because we tend to pick sort of the easiest or the most proximal, and that's not necessarily going to achieve the change in equity and justice that we want. And again, I'll just go to this slide to show you one of the ways that we did this. So we were trying to talk about the determinants of mental health. This is in Arabic. The determinants of mental health in the project in Lebanon. And what you see here is the ecological model. So on the rightmost, where you just see the one box, that says mental health. And then you see the concentric circles that the first one is young people, so intrapersonal or individual. The next one is peers and parents, so interpersonal. The next one is school, so organizational. And then the next one is community-based organization, so the community aspect. And then the furthest one is sort of political, socioeconomic, social conditions. And what you see there is what's not a sticky note is what we did as an academic institution, going back and seeing in the literature what are the determinants of mental health at each of these levels. And all of the sticky notes are local knowledge about what they think is influencing mental health at each of these levels in their own community. And so it's I think a really good example of both co-learning, but also sort of emphasizing the ecological perspective. 7 is involve systems development through a cyclical and iterative process. And a good example, I think, about this. So this is the idea that even though a particular project now might not solve all the problems, the idea of creating community engagement and a continuous relationship, which is number 9, a long-term process, means that the next time we do something, we might be able to, to tweak even more. We might be able to move a little bit from the proximal to the distal, just slowly moving up. And I think a great example that I see of that in the PM Plus work that we're doing in Iowa is the facilitators of our pilot project. We are scaling that up across Iowa, and the facilitators from our pilot project are now training trainers. So they've become training of trainers. And that, I think, shows how, both the iterative and cyclical process and the attention to local knowledge and to equity and justice in this process. Disseminating findings and knowledge gained to all partners and involving all partners in the dissemination process. So this is really important, like who do you disseminate to and how? And so in the project from Beirut, we have disseminated a lot in academia, but we also spent a lot of time in community sharing our findings and getting from them their perceptions of, why are we finding these things? What are the implications for them? How did we get here? I've talked about a long-term process and addressing issues of race, ethnicity, racism, social class. That's really important. And that's about putting these issues on the table. So a lot of times we are a little scared of these issues and we don't put them on the table. But CBPR would say, we're not going to get to issues of equity and justice unless we actually on the table are very clear about the histories that got us to this point, the histories of colonialism, of patriarchy, of capitalism, and all those other isms that actually have made have led us to the place where we are. I'm noting the time, and it's 10 till. I'm just going to go through a few of these questions and then open for questions and comments from you. And again, I will share the slides, and please feel free to reach out to me on some of the other issues as well. How do we distinguish community-based from community-placed research? So community-placed research is research that's done in a particular community. So we might go into a refugee community and do research. That would be community-placed. But it isn't necessarily community-based because it hasn't engaged anybody yet. It's way at the left side of that continuum of community-engaged research. So some of the questions to ask ourselves are, who chose the problem to be studied? Is there an intervention or service component? So not only research. Who designed the intervention? Who made the research policy decisions? Who writes the papers and makes the presentations? And where are the results disseminated? So basically the question is, where does power lie? And power should lie in community, whenever we're doing community engaged research and practice or participatory praxis. Another way to ask these questions is, are we collaboratively developing critically conscious knowledge? And this is an amazing article that I would recommend that you read if you're interested in this work. Because in this article, they actually do give a case study, and you're reading the case study, and in the beginning you're thinking, you get a sense that something's wrong, but in general you're like, yeah, this is really good. This is community engaged research and practice. And then you read through a little of the issues that they bring up, and then they bring back the case study at another time, and you see the great difference in the two approaches. So it is a beautiful reading for those interested. But the questions that they ask are we collaboratively developing critically conscious knowledge? Are we authentically locating expertise? Are we conducting race conscious, oppressive conscious, ism conscious research and scholarship? And is our work grounded in asset-based understandings of community? And we want our answer to be yes to all of this. And if it's not yes, how do we step back and rethink, revisit, center critically conscious knowledge, center local expertise, center race consciousness, oppressive consciousness, and center asset-based understanding of community. All right, I'll stop there just to see if there's any questions.
Well, then I could, feel free to raise your hand or drop your questions on the Q&A or the chat. I just have a very general question, Rima, and thank you so much. This is such an amazing description of what's involved in community participatory research, community engaged research, and a good reminder of why we do some of the things we do, and also some of the things we need to do more of, and to have more at the forefront. What is the aspect that you find most challenging, when applying these principles? One of the things that I find, and I want to know, I'm curious about your perspective, is how do you navigate the obligations as a researcher, in terms of, what you submit as a grant proposal, what you promise in your grant, what the funders want, the products that are expected from you as an academician, and the realities.
That's a great question. And those are very real. Okay. So there's been all academicians that are involved in community engaged research struggle because academia is not set up for community engaged research. And often I'll say what we do is that, there's a lot, and I'll answer a lot more of your question, but often what we do is also have some projects that are sort of secondary analysis projects that we're doing on the side that can get us some of those quick publications that we need, while we're taking the time doing the work that we really want to do. So that in some ways overburdens. And, I hope that there's starting to be, I think, a critical mass of people that are doing this work and starting to push back against academia. And I think funders are starting to realize, you now hear a lot more about community engagement. I'm not so sure they understand exactly what it means and the time it takes, because the timelines of funding is so different than the timelines for community engagement. So I do think that academia itself is one of the biggest challenges, both in terms of what's expected of us as academics, but also the systems of academia. And working through, like often you have to have a degree to be able to be employed in anything related to academia. So if we're trying to engage community members and be, and be equitable and just in terms of payment and not expect them to be volunteers, which it seems like everybody is expecting them to be, which is completely contrary and breaks apart the whole work that we're doing. It's hard. So what we've done is often tried to find, like, how can we get around the system? I guess this is being recorded, but so is there a way to transfer money to an organization that's a community-based organization, and then let them pay our community mentor or our community, like what are the ways that we can work within the system but outside the system? Because otherwise you get stuck. One of the things in the work that we were doing in Lebanon is that they only reimburse people 40 days later. Okay, so if we wanted to buy, to buy any supplies, the particular company that we were working with had to wait 40 days to get reimbursed for that. That's crazy. That works in big organizations. It does not work in the, with the companies or the organizations or the businesses in the places we want to work. It just doesn't, and it's unfair. Plus, you're actually usually paying more. I mean, what I can get for a croissant in, the camp is probably a fourth of the cost of what I can get for a croissant, in Beirut. It just doesn't make any sense. And so again, like, how do we, so we started to then get, what do you call that? Like advances, and we would use the advance to pay for, so we kept figuring out ways to get around the system. And I know that wasn't exactly your question, but I mean, there's so many layers. There's so many layers of academia that make this work hard. And part of it, I think, is finding others in your university that are doing this work, because I found that powers in numbers is important. So if it's one person going to talk to the controller, that's different than 3 departments or 3 schools or 4 schools or 10 people that are all coming and saying, we have all had this problem. And if you're committed to what you say you're committed to, which is service and equity and justice, this needs to change. And it changes slow, but it does change. The other thing was that, again, I know we're running out of time, but I'll give the example of a funding. So we were trying to get funding from Wellcome Trust in the UK to do the work in the Palestinian refugee camp. And this work was 3 components. It had a young person component, a parent component, a teacher component. So it was an ecological intervention. And we knew we were, the evaluation design was a comparison school and intervention school. So the intervention schools got, the year-long sessions. The comparison school got just 10 sessions. And then we were gonna, cross over and do the whole thing a year later in the comparison schools. Now, the difficulty with that from a pure, in the box evaluation design is some of the teachers taught in both intervention and comparison schools. And the funder came back and said, and this was already, I mean, you have to, again, this is part of the politics. So UNRWA takes care of the schools. There's a lot of mistrust of UNRWA in the community. And so we'd already worked through all that mistrust for a year. Everybody was like, okay with this. And the funder comes back and says, get rid of the school part because there's contamination. And we're like, this is nuts. I had just, like, the day before, I had a meeting with the school board and everything was going on. So, I mean, I think the beauty for me of community-based participatory research is the decision is not mine. And that's such, I mean, the weight it's a joint decision. And so we went back to the community advisory board and said, this is a situation. And they basically said, we don't want to take out the school. And if they're not going to accept it, we'll find a different funder. I mean, so it came from them. And that was beautiful, right? So we figured out a way as academics to turn it around and show why we were not worried about that contamination. And we still got the funding from Wellcome Trust. But I mean, these are the things that happen all the time, and that is probably the biggest challenge. But for me, the beauty of doing this work, the authentic engagement with community is worth all those challenges, I guess I'd say.
I have a question, but I want to be mindful of people's time because I know that we're over. So I don't know if you have like 5 minutes or 2 minutes to.
I'm happy to stay on, but I also acknowledge that, people should feel free to go do the other things that they have in their lives.
I was wondering if you could share like some examples of how you include, like you mentioned, indigenous knowledge at the beginning, or like, local knowledge in research dissemination, particularly working with young people that are often left out of elite academic spaces or policy debates.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, Catalina. And I think I gave a little bit of an example when I showed that sort of that picture. So the idea is that we do each have roles to play. And particularly in this interaction between funders and what funders want versus, funders are often wanting an evidence-based intervention, quote unquote. The evidence often comes from places that are very different, but sometimes the starting point to convince the funder, depending on who the funder is, that this is a worthwhile proposition to support is to start from the basis of an evidence-based intervention. So that was our job, right? We went back and we basically found, at first we did the determinants, but then after we decided on mental health and decided on what determinants we wanted to work with, we went back and actually looked at what is the evidence base. And we actually called the evidence informed because it was so different than where the evidence was coming from, and brought that to community. But then we tore it apart, right? So this is what the evidence is. What from your knowledge about what happens in these contexts actually works? How do we need to change this? How do we need to adapt, to fit? How do we need to reinvent to make this feasible, viable, acceptable in this particular community? And that's part of where local indigenous knowledge comes from, their histories, whatever their histories are, past and current. So that's part of how we do it. I think it does mean being open to, it has a lot to do with releasing power. I think a lot of what we're trained in academia is that we are the powerful academic expert. And a lot of this work in community engaged research is really getting rid of power, like is accepting that you're going in with you may be going in with a particular conviction about what's going to work. And in fact, you end up doing something completely different. And that's what trust is all about.
Thank you. So thank you for such a wonderful and complete presentation, Dr. Afifi.
I'm sorry to get through. I never get through all my slides because I'm just too passionate, I think, about this work. But I will share them with you, Catalina, and you can, put them up. And then, if anybody has any questions about the rest, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to engage more in this. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. And thank you everyone for attending.